Good morning. Please welcome from the Washington Post, panel moderator, Joseph Menn.
Morning, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. I wanted to welcome Chris Krebs and Jen Easterly. So, Chris, the title of this session was your idea, World on Fire, Playing Defense and Winning. I understand the World on Fire part. I'm excited to find out something about winning. It seems like it's been a while. But tell me why you came up with that title in the first place.
Well, I think it was actually probably my third or fourth submission for this conference. I have been trying to get a Chris Krebs, Brian Krebs panel for 5 years now. Krebs on Krebs, and it just never makes the cut.
Sorry, man.
So, CISA Director v. CISA Director. World on Fire. So we spent some time this weekend up in Napa Valley with Dmitry Alperovitch, who just dropped a book, World on the Brink. And so it's kind of that overarching theme of it seems as if, at least in our lifetimes, that there is some geopolitical conflagration in every corner of the globe. I mean, we walk around with a briefing deck and a map that has at least 8 hot spots. And the challenge is that, unlike even a decade ago, technology, cyber, information operations, disinfo, is an integral part to conflict, to military doctrine. And when I talk to businesses about it, it's become increasingly clear that, again, unlike 10 years ago, business risk and geopolitical risk are intertwined. You cannot pull them apart. And really, what it's manifesting in are 3 primary risk drivers. One is that the threat actor space is exploding, both from a nation-state perspective as well as a cyber criminal hacktivist perspective. The second is the technologies we use are both shipped in a way that creates risk, vulnerabilities, and they're configured and deployed in a way that is incredibly complex. It's eerily reminiscent of William Gibson's Neuromancer, dating back to 1984, when he talks about cyberspace. He says the unthinkable complexity. And that's what it's like right now to deploy and manage a large enterprise. And lastly, we are just not sitting in place or standing in place because new technologies are emerging on a regular basis. We just heard about AI, generative AI, that really didn't even come onto the scene from a general availability perspective until, what, November 22nd, 2022, or whatever it was. And so we're rolling in these new technologies when we're still struggling with how to deal with the last generation in hyperscale cloud. So it's around every corner, it seems, that there's some sort of risk that we're facing with, not just today, but frankly for the rest of our lifetimes.
Jen, as Chris's successor, the current head of CISA, you are in the hottest of hot seats dealing with all of these things. Let's start with the first one, which is the threat actors. I understand that a couple weeks ago in Beijing, Secretary Blinken told the Chinese foreign minister that bugging critical infrastructure and getting prepared for destructive capability is unacceptable and escalatory. That's a big one. We're not used to seeing that, as you said, that sort of preparation. And then, the ransomware ecosystem is continuing to explode despite law enforcement, international cooperation, other good things that are happening. Their lives at risk in hospitals and elsewhere. And then, of course, we have the SVR in Microsoft, and then getting into government accounts of Microsoft users. Which is the worst of those? How do you deal with those 3 things at once?
Thanks for that softball question, Joe. And congratulations to you on the Pulitzer nomination.
Pulitzer finalist, thank you.
Yeah, as a finalist, still pretty cool. And it's great. I think it's the first time we've been on stage together.
I think so.
Publicly.
Wow.
All right. So it's not Krebs versus Krebs, but
No.
CISA versus
It's pretty
CISA.
good. It's
Pretty good. The CISA, I'm known as the CISA director with not as good hair. So,
Cooler jeans.
so cooler jeans, yeah. So you think about the threat landscape, and I think Chris described it well about just the range of threats that we are dealing with. And I'll just name two, because we could talk forever on threats. But when you think about the scourge of ransomware that we've been dealing with, and you talked about this very early on, Chris, when you were still director of the agency, it's become a multi-billion-dollar, really trillion-dollar business. There's some estimates that the cost of global cybercrime will exceed $10 trillion by next year. So that's one data point. The second is what you mentioned, Joe, and what I testified about at the end of January, which are these Chinese cyber actors, colloquially known as Volt Typhoon, which are burrowing into our critical infrastructure, not for espionage, not for data theft, not for intellectual property theft, but specifically to launch disruptive and destructive attacks in the event of a major conflict in the Taiwan Straits, which many experts predict will happen in the coming 5 years. And that's a world where a major war in Asia could well affect the safety, security, and livelihoods of Americans here at home through the explosion of pipelines, the pollution of water facilities, the severing of communications, the derailing of transportation. And this is all about China's clearly stated doctrine to incite societal panic and chaos and to deter our ability to marshal military might and citizen will. Two very, very real threats. I will just say to the second one, it really is different in kind from anything that I've seen over the past several decades. We always looked at China, highly resourced, highly sophisticated, as an espionage threat. This is a different threat in kind, and it's why we're talking so much about resilience and why we're talking about secure by design, because what those two things have in common, ransomware and Chinese actors infiltrating our critical infrastructure, is they largely take advantage of known public flaws and defects. Why? Because for 40+ years, the technology that has been created and now underpins the critical infrastructure that Americans rely on every hour of every day is inherently insecure. It was created for speed to market. It was created for cool features. It was not created to put security first, which is why, frankly, we have a multi-billion-dollar cybersecurity industry and why we have a cybersecurity agency, because we all use tech that is insecure. And that's why we're very excited to continue to catalyze what we call the Secure by Design revolution, which is all about ensuring that technology manufacturers are building, designing, testing, delivering technology products that are first and foremost secure by design.
So, so until that part, it was mostly more about us being on fire. Secure by design.
That was the winning part.
You can't just talk about like problem identification. You got to talk about solutions.
Okay,
man.
so let's talk about secure by design then. So this seems like still like sort of a voluntary effort, right? And if we're talking about designing stuff, that's probably stuff that won't be in the field, particularly for like operational technology, equipment for a while. What's the roadmap? How do we get there?
Yeah, well, you think about it, I sort of talk about this tongue in cheek. Those of you who are old enough will remember Ralph Nader, I think in this city, talked about unsafe at any speed, wrote the book in 1965, because back then people thought car crashes were the fault of bad drivers, not bad cars. And eventually we had seat belts, we had crumple zones, we had anti-lock brakes, we had airbags, but we didn't get seatbelt legislation, I think, until 1983. So we are on a trajectory now where the technology that we're relying upon is way too important to our daily lives. We don't have time to wait 18 years, but how do we make up for decades and decades of no technology minimum standards for cybersecurity? Well, it has to be a recognition across the entire ecosystem that we need to do this together for the collective defense of the nation. And the good news is we are starting to see real change. So we've done this, we've had this campaign for about a year. One of the levers we have that we're using is procurement power, and frankly, it's a lever that anybody who buys technology should use, is to demand that what we get from technology manufacturers is as safe and secure as possible. It's why we're using our federal acquisition regulations. It's why we're using a software attestation form that has to be signed off by CEOs or their designees. And it's why we've implemented this pledge that's going to be signed, I think, tomorrow by over 60 technology companies that say we are committed to taking these steps to ensure that the ecosystem is much more secure than it is today. And yes, Joe, it is a voluntary pledge, but the great thing is we have a platform to be able to advance radical transparency. And so consumers that have to make decisions about what technology they buy will see whether these technology manufacturers actually took these steps. And when we publish it, you'll see we've actually put in objectives, measurements of what right looks like, and how we know we've actually achieved it. So we're excited about it. We're clear-eyed about it because this is a major effort that we are undertaking. But quite frankly, I think it is the only way that we can make ransomware and cyber attacks a shocking anomaly. And that is to ensure that technology is much more secure.
I wanted to follow up on the insecure code issue, which you mentioned as one of the prongs of defeat here. And I think one nice thing is that there's been this big conflict in the industry for decades over which is worse, closed source or open source for security. And I think we've reached a kind of detente in the last year where people realize that they're both absolutely terrible. We've had the series of breaches at Microsoft, and then we had XZ-Utils, which is like everybody's nightmare. It's a open source project where a top contributor eventually got control and then backdoored it. And ironically, it was caught by somebody at Microsoft. So there's some poetic balance in that. But disasters on both fronts. And to me, the big problem is the ecosystem for each. Microsoft, there's a monopoly issue. And in open source, there's a tragedy of the commons. So, Chris, I feel like you can get away with saying more now that you're out of government. If you were going to...
That's gotten me fired before. So.
If you were going to pick one of those, pick closed source maybe, because you used to work at Microsoft, and tell me how you fix the ecosystem.
So there are ultimately 4 levers. And Jen talked about one, which is voluntary efforts through initiatives like Secure by Design that rely upon corporate responsibility. But also, I think there's an awakening of, wait a second, this is really going to start driving customers away because they don't have confidence in our products. And I think you are seeing that at Microsoft with their Secure Future initiative, which is reminiscent of 2003 and the Trustworthy Computing memo signed out by Bill Gates. There are 3 other levers, though. One is civil litigation, so shareholder lawsuits, and putting pressure on companies because of prior mistakes to then first expose those activities, and that's what you see with the SEC lawsuit against enforcement action against SolarWinds and Tim Brown. That is not criminal, that's a civil action. You also have regulatory action, and we have seen over the last couple years that using existing regulatory authorities, government agencies are looking to drive additional cyber enforcement, cyber regulations. The challenge, though, is that you're kind of taking regulations that are not particularly fit for purpose and applying them to cyber, and then they go to the courts in an era where Chevron deference, where the courts typically defer to the regulators in how they interpret and implement the legislative authorities, that's eroding. And we saw that with the EPA, with regulations that they promulgated on the water sector. But we are still having some stickiness with TSA has various authorities, and including in pipelines and rail. And then ultimately, that last piece is legislative action. And that's where I think the spigot's even smaller. It's tighter. You've had CIRCIA, where CISA has the Incident Reporting Authority now, that's going through the notice and comment phase. But beyond that, from a cyber perspective, I just don't see a lot of additional authorities coming out, in part because you look at the calendar, there aren't a lot more legislative days in this session. And they're not going to spend it certainly on cyber for regulatory action across the critical infrastructure community. But all this may be moot because something else is happening in the background, and the majority of our critical infrastructure community are global companies. And I talked about that. That's why the World on Fire piece matters, because these organizations have supply chain dependencies all over the world. They operate in markets all over the world, including in Europe. And Europe is not standing by. Europe is passing several laws across the member countries, going back as far to GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. Now they're in 2.0 of that. They have an AI Act that's going to go into force in January. They have the Cyber Resilience Act that's going to impact virtually every aspect of their critical infrastructure. And what is happening is there's spillover. So as these laws get implemented in Europe and these companies operate in Europe and the US, they tend to set the bar for compliance at the EU level. And so we are seeing that kind of cascading effect. And it's frustrating, particularly in Washington, D.C., because we're not setting the agenda, someone else is. But as I see it, we're seeing some positive reflections in behaviors here in the US, in addition to some of the procurement actions. So, you know, it's not as if things aren't happening. They're happening. They're just not happening necessarily here. And they're a little bit quieter and harder to see sometimes.
Just one add to that. I just appointed Chris yesterday to our Cyber Safety Review Board. We're excited to have him on that. Some of you may have read the recent report from the team about the Microsoft Exchange intrusion by Chinese cyber actors. That one was espionage. But one of the most important levers that I've seen recently, not coming from government, but coming from the corporate sector, and it's really emblematic of what you mentioned, corporate cyber responsibility, is the letter from Satya Nadella that linked security to compensation at the senior executive level. And having spent time in the private sector before I came to this job, that is a symbol of what you really prioritize is where you put your pay and compensation. So that really, really matters. Award decisions, hiring decisions, and the specific guidance that if it's a choice between security and some other priority, do security. So I see these advances in the ecosystem.
These things, they happen, but they don't happen overnight.
Yeah.
Where they do happen overnight tends to be in two situations. One is immediately after a significant incident, and the second is when a new CISO comes in. That's when you get the real spikes. Now, there was a third recently, Shields Up.
Yeah.
When Russia invaded Ukraine, the Shields Up campaign that you guys launched in January in advance of the invasion, the amount of inquiries, requests for briefings, the just interest, and they're like, what does this mean? And the message was, if you have a strategy that you want to accelerate, now's the time to do it before the missiles start flying. Now's the time to do it.
All right, you surprisingly cheered me up on closed source and what's happening. I will just point out, as a matter of geopolitics, it's easier for the EU to do things because they don't have the giant tech companies there lobbying their butts off. So
well, they've regulated them out of existence.
And now they're going to
Right.
regulate ours out of existence. Is that what you're saying? All right, Jen, I want to come back to you on open source, which you have made a priority. But it's a big, gnarly, it's another big, gnarly problem. Tell me about some signs of hope there.
Yeah, I mean, look, the reality is open source is what, 99.99% of all the software we rely upon, so it's incredibly important. It's a very vibrant, innovative, creative community. We've put a lot of effort into reaching out as a member of that community to help catalyze a more secure open source system. We've got experts like Ava Black that joined our team. We've got Jack Cable. We just had a summit where we put out guidance for package managers. We did an exercise around attacks, very interestingly, right before the exautils incident was discovered. And so there is really good work that's happening in that community. And you know, I'm absolutely a buyer on open source because I frankly think the beauty of that is you can have the community that is able to ensure that we are raising the bar, a la the Microsoft employee that was able to find that vulnerability. So a lot of good work. We put out an open source security roadmap last year. Folks should take a look at it, but that's one of the most important initiatives, and it's part and parcel of the Secure by Design ecosystem because open source plays a critical role in that ecosystem.
Right, and coming down to the third prong of destruction, emerging technologies. We've just heard from the Secretary about AI. I think, obviously it's the theme of the conference. I think it was beginning to be the theme of the conference last year, but now they mean it. There are obviously a lot of good things about AI, including the scanning code and maybe self-patching. There's lots of really good possibilities, like going through all those reams of logs that you've now wrested from Microsoft's control. But there's obviously some scary things, and I think the elections are on everybody's mind. This is the biggest global year of elections, I think, ever. And there is nothing that I can see tangibly happening to warn people about deepfakes that's actually in play yet. There's plans, but I think it's a scary landscape, and AI is going to make it worse. So, anybody want to take a crack at how we fix that one?
You can start. I'll be the cleanup.
So look, I think we have to kind of step back and think about what the real risk picture looks like with AI and risks to critical infrastructure, to elections. Alex Stamos and I, we are doing a regular podcast now with Patrick Gray, and we just taped one yesterday. Should come out, but the focus here is AI. And the way Alex talks about it is there are going to be waves of offense, defense, conflict, and basically combat in AI. Right now, we're in the initial operational phase. Next is going to be AppSec, and then who knows what that third phase is. But the good news is that defense, because of the private sector investment in tools and capabilities, yay, capitalism, defense is winning right now. Offense is going to have a longer tail and catching up. If you look at the OpenAI Microsoft report that came out at the end of January, what they're seeing across their AI deployments are the bad guys using AI for social engineering, research, scanning, and basic functionality automation. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty basic. On the other hand, look at this conference. The AI-powered tools that we're spitting out on a regular basis that are enabling threat hunting, configuration review, automated investigation, SOAR, all this stuff. It's so much higher speed and faster to market in a good way. Now, I think AI in the kind of amplification space of the value chain, there is a ton of risk because we just don't fully grok what where the chinks in the armor are. And there's safety, there's privacy, there's regulatory, there's legal, there's reputational, there's business operations. So we're going to continue to kind of struggle, I think, to get our arms around where the risk is. And we don't, unfortunately, have the real enterprise risk management tools to put a wrapper around it like we did, as I mentioned, with hyperscale cloud in the early days, where we eventually came up with CASB. We need that AI equivalent.
So I think even cloud adaptation was slower than this. I mean, the thing that this reminds me of is the internet. And, as Vint Cerf once told me, that he meant to get around to security. It just kind of escaped from the lab before he could, and now it's too late. And I feel like that's what's happening with AI. It's happening so fast. There's so much money in it, and the incentives, once again, are kind of out of whack. The incentives are to get something in the market, to get lots of people using it, to grab as much data as you can. It's not to make it,
No, that's exactly right. Look, this conference is called The Art of the Possible, and AI has captured the world's imagination, but it's the responsibility of leaders to leverage that power of imagination but avoid the failure of imagination. AI is moving faster, is more unpredictable, and is more powerful, and will be the most powerful weapons of this century, as well as the most powerful technology. We know the most powerful weapons of the last century were built and safeguarded by governments who were disincentivized to use them. The incentives, as you said, Joe, is completely different because these are built mostly by private companies that have a fiduciary responsibility to their shareholders to make profits. That's why the government is doing so much to get ahead of this, where we failed to do in the days of technology, in the early days, when Vint was creating the TCP/IP protocol. And as you heard from the secretary, there's a lot of good work going on. I do want to just take the last minute to hit on elections, because I did a piece on this with Secretary of State Scott Schwab of Kansas, and the top line on it is AI will exacerbate the threats that exist to our elections, whether that's spear phishing, whether that's foreign influence and disinformation. It will not fundamentally change those threats. So we have to remember that since 2017, when election infrastructure was designated as critical, CISA, our partners across the federal government, have made extensive progress in improving the security and resilience of the nation's election infrastructure, working to support the state and local election officials who serve on the front lines of our democracy, administering, managing, and defending our election infrastructure. And as a result, those election officials ran secure elections in 2018, in 2020, and in 2022. As we know, there is no evidence that malicious actors had any impact on the election, altered, changed, or deleted votes. And that's been validated time and again, including in multiple court challenges. And of course, in any place where the margin was close in 2020, there were paper ballots that were counted and recounted and audited to ensure security. In this job, I've had the privilege to spend a lot of time, as you did, with chief election officials across the country. And I know how hard they work to ensure that their citizens' votes are counted as cast. And those election officials know that while elections are political, election security is not. And that's why I have confidence in the integrity of our elections and why the American people should as well.
Krista, do you want to get in the last one?
I'm reconsidering that. I cannot beat that. That was amazing.
Let's hope that this November is just another Tuesday on the internet.
Did I say that?
Director Screbs.
I'm sorry, no, that was an unnamed U.S. government official.
We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, and thanks for being a great crowd.